Hey folks, back at it with another recap from the 2026 Fide Candidates Tournament. And this time we're in round six of the open and women's sections. And this round was characterized really by a lot of time trouble. There was a lot of action in that time trouble. And yeah, let's just jump right into it. So in this game, we have Wei Yi with white against Javakir Sindarov. Sindarov has been the darling of this event. Through 5 rounds, he was on 4.5 out of 5. So it was really just, can anyone stop him? This train, or has this train just left the station and you just can't catch up to it? So Wei Yi was now the man to put in front of Sindarov, and he actually is a pretty good position here. His king is safe and castled, the rooks are connected, there's pressure against this potential double pawn on f6. The real issue, if there is any issue, is this rook on a1 is attacked, and this bishop on d4 is a monster. So this bishop on d4 looks at a1, it looks at g1. It's just perfectly centralized. It blocks any pressure against the potentially backward d6 pawn. So it's a really incredible bishop. And in some ways, it's actually better than the bishop on h4, because even though it's pressuring this f6 pawn, there are scenarios where if the pressure against this pawn goes away, this bishop might actually just be a liability on this diagonal. So Wei had an hour and 12 minutes here, so you'd say, well, what's the issue? There's no time trouble here. But essentially in this position, he thought for 46 minutes over what to do. It turns out that the best move is just to kind of deal with this rook in some way that's attacked. And you can play rook a2. That's a very unnatural move, but the move the computer prefers the best. A more natural move, in my view, would actually be rook a d1. And one of the ideas is that in a lot of these positions, the f6 pawn can be sacrificed if black gets a lot of activity. So the main line, I would say, is something that goes queen d7, rook d3, and something like queen g4. And the idea in some of these positions is that if you take on g4, rook takes g4, there are real issues defending the e4 pawn, and in some positions, even the pawn on a3. But rook d1 here was reasonable, and after queen e7, you could play h3 to stop queen g4, and white retains a very, very slight advantage, although nothing really serious. And black does have a lot of activity based upon the position of his rook. So Sindarov actually is not doing so poorly here because the rooks are so active. Instead of that, after bishop d4, Wei played bishop takes f6. And it's so funny because sometimes these long thinks don't lead to higher quality moves. In fact, it actually happens a lot where it's the opposite. And it seems like the most natural move in the world to win a pawn with tempo against the queen on d8. But the issue is that after queen d7, the rook is still attacked, and you have this issue of queen g4 again. And so rook a d1 was played, and black can already play queen g4. And the point is that after queen g4, if the rook moves to d3, defending the queen and the rook on the pawn on a3, there's still pretty good pressure here. In fact, queen e6, the computer suggests, is a good move, or even rook g6, pressurizing the bishop on f6. But instead of playing queen g4, Sindarov just played queen e6. And this is actually the best move. It hits the pawn on c4, the bishop on f6 you have to take care of, and also the pawn a3 is still a bit loose. So this queen on f3 is essentially clocking overtime. And it's just a hard dynamic to cover all of these pawns that seem a little bit weaker than you'd think. And after h3, Wei decided to give it up. And you can see here the time situation, 17 minutes to 1 hour, is not where you want to be with 20 moves to go. So more moves ensued. Black won their pawn back, shuffled this king to the king side, and then played this excellent break c5. And it's just clear that this bishop is a menace to society. Again, it has a perfect centralization on d4, looking at both diagonals, basically being an attacker and defender, covering the backward d6 pawn. And this bishop on h4, as I mentioned before, kind of hitting air right now, not the diagonal you'd want it to be on. So more moves ensued. Unfortunately, Wei is getting further and further into time trouble. And in his time trouble, he played the move rook takes d6, which actually is a losing move. And the reason it's losing is because after rook takes d6, there's this very strong move queen e3, which Sindarov played in 10 seconds. Yes, when Sindarov actually feels the position is winning, he actually plays these moves very quickly, and it's extremely impressive. And yeah, I mean, Wei considered actually playing the move queen h4, but it actually doesn't work. He actually kind of picked up the queen, was about to play queen h4, and then took it back. And what he realized at the last moment is that after queen h4, it runs into queen g3. And rook e1 is a checkmate threat. And even after trading queens, the white king has a massive, massive back rank issue. So you have to go rook d1 to deal with that. And now c4 is clinical. Because if now king g1, c3, or sorry, not c3 first. We're going to go rook e2 first. Rook c1 and then c3. And the problem is you still can't take the pawn on c3 because the rook on e2 would deliver mate on e1. This is just a back rank mate because of what I like to call this thorn pawn that is just sitting there stealing escape squares from the white king. So you have to play a move like king f1, but after rook f2 check, the king has to just go here, give up, and then go c2, and then you're basically allowing this pawn to dominate the rook on c1. g2 will hang, and one of these pawns, the g or c pawn, will wind up queening. So yeah, instead of queen h4, Wei played the move queen f3, and queen f3 still misses the mark because it runs into c4. And notice that even though the g file is open, there are no checks to this black king. It's completely safe. And the point is now, if this pawn becomes a passer, which now it is, you just can't deal with it. The queen went to g4 with check, king f8 happened. Now there was a one check, but it's just one check because now the rook has to just come back. Note if you try to get active, you play a move like queen h5, queen e1 check, king h2, and queen g3 leads to mate on e1 again. So this is just a recurring problem. The king is not safe on the white king, that is. So after rook d1, c3, c2 is a massive threat, queen g5, f3, wonderful move, threatening the trade of queens and also stopping queen h6 check from happening for white. The queens have to come off the board, and sadly, there's nothing to be done here, and Wei actually resigned, because if you do play g takes f3 now, there's only one pawn to deal with, but the problem is the second rank is wide open. So there's this tactical pattern with c2, rook c1, and rook e2, and the king is too far away to prevent rook d2 and rook d1 check. So king g1, rook d2, king f1, and rook d1 check forces a trade of, well, not a trade, it forces the rook to basically forfeit its position on the first rank, which would result in the c-pawn queening. So what to make of this? Sindarov is on 5.5 out of 6. This is the most impressive tear through a candidates tournament ever to date through this point in the event. And yeah, it's a question of, can anyone stop him? Can anyone catch up to him? And there's really one player right now that has the very small chance of doing so, and it's Fabiano. So we're going to take a look at that game and see what happened in his. So unfortunately for Fabiano, he basically has no advantage coming out of the opening into the early middle game. The reason for that here is because black's rooks are connected, white's rooks are connected, black's king is relatively safe and has a nice escape score in f7. The position is really symmetrical and compact, and there really is, it's hard to make any inroads here. Fabiano tried playing knight b5, trying to tickle the queen side in some way, looking at a7 and c7. Maybe on a good day, you might get rook c1 and knight c7. But Yasipenko was up to the task defensively. He played a6. After bishop d2, the knight is attacked. So you might say, oh no, if the knight moves, maybe this knight can jump into d6 and something can happen. But Yasipenko actually found a takes b5. And this trade of knights allows the white rook to get active, but a rook alone is not going to do too much damage. And Yasipenko actually even gave up the b6 pawn for activity. He played b4, giving up the b6 pawn to basically say, you know what, I'm going to trade a pair of rooks, and this b pawn makes this a pawn backward. So this pawn on b4 actually kind of makes one pawn two. It's controlling two pawns, and it's just simply making all of white's pieces passive. The rook on a1 has to defend a2. The bishop on a7 is pretty much in no man's land, nothing really going there. And to add insult to injury, the king on f3 that would love to try and target this rook can't really doing anything because it has to babysit the f2 pawn. So they played another, 15 moves or so, but after the time control, it was just, it was always going to be a draw. There was nothing about it that was more than procedural. And yeah, Fabi was not able to make any ground. Actually, he lost ground with Sindarov winning. So Fabi's now a point and a half behind Sindarov with 8 rounds to go. He has 4 out of 6. Sindarov has 5.5 out of 6. And that's just the state of play right now. The other games really didn't get much off the ground either in the open section. I will show you one position from the Geary versus Blue Bomb game from the opening. This is a Queen's Gambit exchange variation, and it's black to move. And in this position, normally black plays the move bishop e7 or knight bd7. I had a very famous game against Moisenko with the move bishop d6. This was a line I pioneered way back when in 2019. Go check out that game if you haven't. That is a beautiful game. But in this position, Blue Bomb went for the very, very, very solid line, bishop f5. And the reason this has such a solid reputation is because it leads to basically a queenless middle game, which is very, very dull. And the position is queen f3, taking advantage of the bishop coming out a little bit early before white's knight has developed. And after bishop g6, you actually take on f6, give up the bishop pair to basically create these double pawns. And the question is, do these double pawns on the king side, are they a big enough issue that white can really exploit them? And the modern state of theory, the current state of theory suggests it's not really enough. And the game really didn't change that opinion or the state of play. So there are plenty more moves. I'm going to flip through them now. White does blockade the weaknesses, the h pawn and the f pawn, and tries to play around them. But really, black just sits and waits. Black does not create any weaknesses on the queen side, even though they have a majority. They try to control all the squares on the 5th rank, which you see black is doing a great job of doing, and doesn't really touch the b pawn, because if you touch the b pawn, then the c pawn might be weak. So you just kind of chill and maneuver. And Anish, he is someone that can maneuver with the best of them, but did not make any inroads in this position. And yeah, they did this little dance all the way through the time control. But as you can see, nothing's really changing. And the position later, finally, I'll just get to it, all the way on move 84 was a draw. So yeah, kind of a nothing burger, but Blue Bomb did lose yesterday against Fabiano and maybe wanted to kind of just be solid today. He actually, did, flash a smile after the game when they were analyzing, and I'd never seen Blue Bomb smile or be happy. I think it was more a smile of relief, like, I held it down, I didn't lose 2 in a row, that's fine for me. The last game on the open section was a game between Hikaru Nakamura and Prague. Now, Hikaru lost to Sindarov yesterday, and it was a tough one. He didn't have any prep in a very critical line. There was a lot of talk about that. He talked about his seconds not preparing him well, and really unfortunate situation all the way around. Prague, on the other hand, hasn't really shown anything meaningful in this event after the first few rounds, and he stood on 50% going into this one. So both sides needed to win, but today was not the day. In this very critical position, it looks like white is about to attack. There's an h-file that's about to open. This h-pawn can come to take on the pawn g6, maybe go to h6 sometimes, make this king a little bit awkward. But it actually turns out that you have to be very careful, because if white plays a move like h takes g6, which I think a lot of amateurs would consider, the problem is that after f takes g6, there's too much pressure on the f2 pawn, and this rook on f8 can come up to f7 and protect the h7 pawn very easily. So there's just no attack here if you take right away. So you got to be patient and you got to build, and Hikaru tried to do that with rook h3. But the problem with rook h3 is that you don't have another rook to come behind it really easily, and there's just not enough firepower for an attack to really hit home. So this gives Prague time to do stuff on the queen side. he played the move b5. Very good move, just kind of expanding on the queen side, making you think twice about just forgetting about that side of the board and focusing just on checkmating the black king. And white played king g1, trying to kind of brace himself for some counterplay before trying to dive in. But Prague took more space with c4, and now the real issue came, and that's after queen h6, which now kind of might be threatening something. If h takes g6, queen h7 would be kind of a checkmate thing. The problem is that Prague has this very easy and nice move, knight g4. And the point of knight g4 is you're hitting the queen, not allowing time to play h takes g6, but you're also hitting the pawn on f2, which is a mate threat that white would have to deal with queen takes f2, queen takes c1. So because of that, the white queen just has to go back, and then the black maintained its position with the knight on e5. And the problem is if you try to do anything else here, like if you try to go rook f1 and say, you know what, I'm going to hold off on queen h6, no harm, no foul. Now black has a move like knight d3, and once the knight is anchored on d3, this is an octopus situation. This knight controls so many important squares. The b2 pawn is hanging, f4 is loose, so maybe knight f4, queen f4 is a thing. Again, if you go queen h6, queen g7 is there. So there's just no way to make meaningful inroads to the position, and white can easily be worse here. So instead, we had a very, very quick repetition with queen h6, knight g4, queen d2, and that was the game. And both sides, packed it up early. And it's so funny because in this tournament, it's really just first place or last place. Second, third, fourth. You might get a little bit of extra money here and there, but it's really about qualifying for the World Championship. And this result hurts both players, but there wasn't much they could do in this one, at least when they got here. So hopefully they can, their fortunes will turn in future rounds. But all of these guys are chasing Javikir Sindarov, and he's someone that keeps winning. So the draws just don't even help. Forget not losing. You got to win games to catch this guy. All right, on to the women's section. There was a ton of time trouble here. It's kind of bewildering how much time trouble there was in all of the decisive games today. And we're going to take a look at this first one. So very messy position on the board. So understandable that time is taken here between Zujiner and Anna Muzychuk. Let's just look at the material breakdown. White has two knights and, basically two knights to black's rook and two pawns. So you could say that's approximately equal. Maybe the knights are worth 3. I always argue knights and bishops are worth a little bit more than 3, but let's say that's 3 for just to be traditional. That's 6. Black has a rook and 2 pawns. That's 7. So you could say black is a pawn up, but really the feature is the king safety. This king on g7 has no potential checks to it that are good. And this king on h1 has no pawns around it and is pretty exposed. And so the knights, if they were able to kind of, be more in attacking positions, and if there were some pawns around the king, it'd be a different story. But here, it's just not very good. And so because of that, white has to try to find counterplay against the black king before this becomes more of an issue. And in this position, the best move is queen c5. You look at moves like queen e7 check, you eye the e5 pawn, but the real idea is that if black does nothing, let's say black makes a passing move like a5, let's say, you want to play knight g4. You want to bring the knight to g4, attack the e5 pawn, block any checks on this diagonal, and you want to get some pressure here to get something against the king ultimately. So that's the idea, and that's what you should do. But again, under 6 minutes, 6 minutes for 6 moves, or move 34 here, Zujiner played the move knight g4 right away. And I promise you she was going to play something like queen c5 or queen c3 next to attack the e5 pawn. But the move order actually is important here. And the reason for that is black here can play queen h3. And that's what Anna did. And the threat now is rook f1 checkmate. So if you go queen c5 here, trying to get to the e5 pawn, rook f1 is a checkmate because the knight is actually pinned. So huge turnaround there, huge turn of events, kind of a cold shower. and Zhu spent almost all her remaining time. She had 4 minutes and 28 seconds, and she spent 4 minutes and 19 seconds to play Queen C1. And I think really the truth, the reality was setting in that a huge mistake kind of turned the fortunes of the game, because I think that's why she basically used all her time, is just to kind of have that reality set in. I've done it myself. Now black wins a very critical pawn on d3. The e4 pawn is now weak, and that's a rook and 3 pawns for the 2 knights. That's just too much. And there's still this weakened king. And just a few more moves were played. Queen e1, rook f4, knight f2, queen g3. And now white actually resigned, because there's a nasty pin on the queen on e1. There's really only one sensible way to break it, which is knight d3. But now, given that black has so many pawns, well, actually the knight is hanging here, but I was going to say, even taking the queen and taking a 4th pawn would be more than enough. These knights have no competition with the rook and 1,000 pawns. So it turns out knight d3 doesn't even work. There's really nothing you can do here to lose even more material. And yeah, Anna won a nice game. Anna's now the leader. She's on 4 out of 6. This is a matchup between leaders. Zhu Jinner had won 2 games in a row. She now loses a game and remains on 3. And Anna was again the replacement player for Humpy Cornero, who didn't make it to not to make it to Cyprus. And so amazing, the replacement is actually leading the event so far. All right. Next event was another time trouble show in front of trying to make moves in front of a live studio audience when you have no time is wild. And in this one, you see, look at the clock times. We're on move 32, and it's 2 minutes to 1 minute. So just nuts. And a board full of pieces, which makes it even more nuts. It was black to move here, and Vaishali did play a brilliant move here. It actually did even get the brilliant signage from the chess.com move scores here, and bishop f3 was played. Amazing move. The point is that if you actually take this bishop, which was captured, this pawn on f3 becomes a thorn pawn. We mentioned it in the Sindarov game. It's a pawn deeply entrenched in the opponent's camp that is controlling escape squares around the king. That's how I define it, at least. Hard to deal with, because now queen h3 is a kind of a checkmating idea. Queen g4 is a similar idea, and it's just impossibly difficult to ignore. So black is winning here. Vaishali is winning. Lochno has had many losing positions, and she needs to try to fight, and she has fought well, and she did so here momentarily with the move queen d3, which says, what, you have a threat against my king, I'm going to create a threat against your king with queen takes g6 check. And here, again, look at the time trouble, minute each. Vaishali played a mistake that I can't really blame her for, given the time trouble, because she played the move rook f5, blocking the check on g6 and saying, I'm going to block the check, and I still have the threats with queen g4 and queen h3. What's the problem? And the problem is that this actually allows rook takes f3. And the pawn that was the thorn pawn, creating the mating ideas, is now gone. Huge turn of events. It went from losing in one move to winning in one move for Lochno. But there were still some adventures to go. Now, you might be wondering, what was the best move? Actually, not very easy here. The move was rook takes e3. And the point is that if you go queen takes g6 check, it's just one check. The king can go to h8. And now the same problems arise with this kind of checkmating ideas here. And the point is, if you go f takes e3, taking the rook, this is the really hard move. Shockingly, knight f6 wins. You leave the rook hanging, and knight f6 wins. The point being that knight g4 is a threat, coming in with queen h2 check, queen f2 checkmate. So if you have like queen takes f7, now queen g3 mates, and this pawn helps deliver checkmate on e2 again. And if you do something else, you go like rook f1, this knight comes to g4 and supports queen h2 checkmate. So this is a nuts position. Like, it's insane, and it's totally reasonable to not have seen this, because the point is you're actually giving up your other rook to actually deliver the mate. And the funny thing is, you can also take with the bishop on e3, but I think this is easier to spot. Rook g7 wins the queen. And when the queen comes off the board, this pawn f3 is still on the board. This type of position, I like to call this mate, and the X marks the spot mate, because it's typically right there. You can make an X with the pawn, the thorn pawn, as I like to call it, and the queen. So really, really crazy lines that were not found. After rook f5, rook takes f3, white is winning. And now knight g5 was played by Vaishali, and we got 33 seconds to 1 minute. And this is a scary position where the rook is attacked twice. There's knight h3 check ideas in some positions. All these pieces look super menacing. And it looks like you want to get rid of that knight, but unfortunately it's not the right move. Lucknow did play bishop takes g5, but the best move is actually rook takes f5. And I can tell you I would not have played this if I was Lucknow. I would have played what she did. The point here is that knight h3 check is just one check. And after king g2, actually it's not just one check, it's more than one check. If you play queen takes f2, shockingly, well, rook takes f2 takes the queen, but even king takes h3, and there's no, and the king here is actually safe somehow. The bishops are covering squares, the queen's covering squares. And if you play rook takes f5, threatening some rook takes f2 business, or queen takes f2 business, there's rook f1, defending f2 with just one piece. But the point is that now, again, if you like take again on f2, white can take on h3 in the end, and it's just the queen that emerges from this as the dust settles. Black only has one attacking piece. And after rook f1, you can give another check like knight f4, but the bishop comes back and takes the knight. So in a position where there are all these pieces around white's king, none of them are killing you. And the real idea now is that this queen on d3 can sweep over and try to start trading some pieces. Nuts. So bishop takes g5 was played instead. Very human. Rook takes g5 and rook g3, blocking the check. Still good. And now queen h3, and there are more threats. And the point with queen h3, brilliant move in time trouble, by the way, from Vaishali, is that now h4 is a threat. So if white does nothing, let's say white plays like a5, that's a pass. Now h4 forces this rook to make a decision because the pawn is threatening to take it. And any move with this rook actually loses. So rook takes g5, rook takes g5, basically leaves the king in dire straits. The queen cannot block in any, it can only just go to g3, and that delays mate only momentarily. And yeah, I mean, what else is there after h4? Well, it turns out the only good move is queen f1, giving up the rook. Again, these are not very human lines. I'm just showing you how complicated this position was. So instead, after rook g3, queen h3, with this threat of h4, white finally cracked. The right move is actually this move, queen f3. And we just talked about this a moment ago. Well, what about h4? Well, it turns out you give up the rook by playing queen g2, and you say, look, I'm up a piece already, and I just need to trade the queens, and you don't have time to take my rook because the queen on h3 is hanging. So because of that, you got to trade queens first, and when you trade queens, then I'll take with my rook on g2. My rook on will be safe. I will trade the pieces, and I'm winning. After queen h3, f3, h4, queen g2, there is rook takes g3, and then there's some more drama because after f takes g3, queen g4 can be played, insisting on keeping the queens on the board. And again, there's only one winning move here for white, and it's not an easy move to make. I mean, you're looking here and you're saying, well, rook e2 is a threat. That's going to be a huge issue. H3 is a threat. H takes g3 is a threat. And I'm not sure I would play the move that is winning here. It's actually knight d2. And the point is that after rook e2, queen f3, you're actually finally get trading the queens off the board because there's no way to defend the rook and keep your queen on the board. But this is nuts, and it's nuts with this level of time trouble. So queen f1 was played, and it's a loser because now you actually allow rook takes g3 check, f takes g2, the queen takes g3. And the issue is with queen g2 now, it's black to move, and this queen can do other stuff. And this check is devastating. Point being that you're hitting the king, but now you also have time to play rook g5, and that's basically what happened. King h2, rook g5, queen h3, queen f4. No trades of queens happening here. And then rook g3, king g7. There was just a few checks. And then a few more moves, and that was it. And white resigned in this position when it still looks like there's finally some shelter for the king, but now there are tactical issues, because if king g1 is played, rook takes g2 actually wins the queen on e7. And when there's a naked king, tactics are abound. So that was a really messy game. Black was winning at the beginning of it, then white was winning, defending in that sequence, and then black was winning again. And it's just not a surprise that when you have that level of time situation, again, if we back this up to where we were here, each side is 1 minute, many moves to go. It's best play is just not happening. So Vaishali got the best of Lucknow here. Lucknow's luck ran out to some degree. She almost, capitalized at the end, but turned out luck was not on her side, and yeah, she lost the game. So Vaishali's on 3 out of 6. Lucknow's on 3 out of 6. Only a point behind the leader, but crazy game for both. Next one was another crazy time scramble, and I actually was showing you the final position, which I did not mean to show you. So I'm going to go back here. And this is a position where they're on move 36, and look at the time situation again. Bibisara has 3 minutes, Divya has 37 seconds, and it's a mess. There's both kings are a little exposed. These pawns have been pushed a little bit, but there is some tension here, and Divya's actually has this pawn on c6 she has to deal with that is very, very dangerous. She also has to deal with f takes e6, opening up the position towards the king. And so her last move, very naturally, was to try to trade rooks with rook d1. Now, inexplicably here, Bibisara played the move rook f2. And that's just a mistake, because now the c6 pawn, which was the pride and joy of white's position, can be captured. Rook takes c6 is just a clear pawn, and there's no real way to win opening up, because after f takes e6, black can trade the pair of rooks and then play rook takes e6. And even though this pawn structure is ugly, Divya's an extra pawn up on the queen's side and an extra pawn up on the queen's side. So it should be winning. Instead, Divya did not play rook takes e6. She played the move rook takes f1. Again, this is time trouble. And after rook takes f1, she still didn't take that pawn that was hanging. She played the move queen g5, trying, I think, to stabilize. Basically trying to say, I'm going to trade queens and then be safe. No harm, no foul. But again, this pawn on c6 is just hanging for multiple moves. And now Bibisara, she could defend that pawn. She could play the move queen c3 and defend the c6 pawn, defend the g3 pawn, and still have a game to play for here. But somehow, some way, she instead decided to play queen d3. And now, finally, Divya's like, I can take that. There's no threat on the d8 square. That square is covered, so there's no checks that really hurt. And now, essentially, Divya's won that pawn and has an extra pawn on the queen side. And if she can weather the storm of any attack on the king side, she'll be fine. So there was one more move to the time control here. This was move 40, and as this happens a lot, move 40 can create mistakes. And Bibisara played the move f6, and it's a losing move. Instead, queen f3 was the best move, but this is not an easy one to see. The point is that if black tries to get active, let's say like rook c1, trying to trade more pieces, there's this nifty tactic queen a8 check, and if the king goes to g7, f6 check, king g6, queen g8 check, and after the trade of queens with check, the rook would be hanging. So, very crazy line. Because queen f3, to see this with 30, 40 seconds on your clock is hard. Instead, she did play f6, and the problem is that after the very simple rook c8, defending the back rank, there's no attack on this king, and more importantly, the e5 pawn and the g3 pawn are real targets that make it hard for white to get active enough to create any further threats on the black king. Bibisara is a tricky player, and she tried. So she played rook d1, threatening a back rank checkmate. Note if you pass with a move like a6, queen d8 is a checkmating idea. But instead, Divya just played the move king h8, which is best. Point being now, if you give this check here, black can actually take and block with the queen. And this is just a winning king-pawn endgame with the extra pawn on the queen side. So instead, king g2 is played, and now h5, queen d2, queen g4, keeping the queens on just a little longer to open up the position a little bit more. And this is just clean up on Al5, essentially. You're pawn up with pressure, and in this position, Bibisara actually had to resign. Crazy turnaround in the time trouble, and a crazy turn of events for Bibisara, because she was basically on 2.5 out of 4, and now she's on 2.5 out of 6. So really, really unfortunate turn of events for her. Divya, on the other hand, did get that coveted win. She had not won a game thus far. She's back to 50% and only a point behind the leaders. So huge turn of events for her. And yeah, now she's still in it. India has something to look forward to in the future rounds. Last but not least, we had another time trouble situation. It was a mutual time trouble, but Alexandra Goretchkina had 5 minutes for a few moves, getting to the time control. And she has a great position. There's a queen for rook and bishop. And really the pride and joy of her position is this pawn on h4. If she's able to keep this pawn h4 and meaningfully press, she'll probably win the game because the king will be too weak. And this pawn is able to kind of become a thorn pawn on h3. And so it turns out that the best move here is actually this move, queen e6. And it actually is a very simple threat. Queen e1 is checkmate. So if you do nothing, queen e1 is mate. Now, because you have to deal with that threat, it means the h-pawn lives. And this makes all the difference. So now, if you play a move like king f1, which you have to do to defend the queen e1 checkmate threat, now queen c6 hits f3. You got to defend that. King defends. And now h3. And the issue with this h3 pawn is it's basically creates that kind of X marks the spot pattern I was mentioning. But it also means that the h2 pawn will be a chronic weakness. So there's some positions much later in the game where this queen gets behind on the first rank and gets to h1, the h2 pawn will just be picked off. And because of this chronic weakness, it means that white has to babysit this side of the board. While white babysits that side of this board, this king can zigzag its way all on the light squares and get very close to the white king and then start to create checkmating threats. And because of this, black is winning. Instead, Goretchkina played the move queen f5. And it seems to have most of the same ideas, right? You're attacking the f3 pawn, you're threatening h3. That h3 is a desirable move, and Goretchkina understands that. And there's no time for g takes h4, because if you play g takes h4, queen takes f3 is a huge issue, and this king on g1 will be too exposed. The only issue is that it doesn't actually threaten a checkmate or anything, and it also allows white one little detail, which is they now can surround the h-pawn that might get to h3, because there are no checks from f5 that hurt the white king. And so what do I mean by that? White now has the very precise and only saving move, king f2. And what's the difference? The point is now if you play h3, the rook goes back to g1, and now let's say queen e6 like before. Well, the difference is now white has this move g4. It's so unfair. And the point is after rook g3, like let's say king f7, rook g3, the pawn h3 is surrounded, and if that pawn drops, white's king is safe. And there's no way to really deal with this meaningfully. So like g4, if queen b6 check, king f1, rook g3 is still a threat. You can give more checks, but rook g3 will be the threat. In the previous line we looked at, just to go back to show how you can't surround the line the other way. Let's say queen e6, say king f1, h3, rook g1, let's say queen c6, blah, 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 queen d6. You don't really get time to play g4 because h2 is hanging. Isn't that unfair? g4 now runs and the queen takes h2. There's no way to surround that pawn. So that little detail means that white actually got to get rid of the h-pawn, and going into the time control, you had a situation where Grechkina just allowed g takes h4. She didn't even try to play h3 because she saw after h3, g3 was happening, right? h3, h3, g4, and then rook g3. Again, no checks here. So unfortunate. There's no check. c5 is covered, and because of that, white has time to not move the rook from g2. And once the pawn came off the board, this is a blockade. And the reason it's a blockade is this king, the black king now, has no way to cross the 5th rank. So there's just nothing really that can be done here. If the king can try, I mean, we can try. Oop, no, not king g6. I'd run into rook g4. But let's say king e6, rook g4, king f5, rook d4. And eventually you get a position like this where the rook is covering the whole 4th rank. So there's no way to cross. And if black's king can't get in on the action, there's just no way that the white king has any problems. The other thing is you might say, well, what if the black king got to b5? Yeah, that could be annoying because if the black king got to b5, it could try to skirt around that way. But the issue here is this rook on d4 is just not going to let the black king cross the Rubicon on the d file. So just there's no way in. And a few more moves were played, but the game ultimately resulted in a draw. Okay, so crazy time trouble in both sections, the opens and the women's section. Sindarov is on 5.5 out of 6, leading the event. On the open side, the closest competitor is Fabiano on 4 out of 6, so 1.5 points behind. And in the women's side of things, Anna Muzychuk is on 4 out of 6. Her closest competitor is actually Zhu Jinner, who is on 3, and Grechkina on 3. Actually, whoa, there are a ton of people on 3. So Zhu Jinner, Alexander Grechkina, Katarina Lakhno, and Divya Deshmukh, and Vaishali are all on 3. So there are 5 people a point behind Anna Muzychuk. So this is all to play for. And yeah, I'm looking forward to future rounds. But can we have folks manage their time better? Because time trouble will kill you. And the one thing I always say is like, again, it's not the perfect analogy, but it's almost like people that, drive and drink and drive or something like that, right? And it's like, oh, I couldn't see the road, I was driving, or oh, I was a little tired, I was under the influence. And it's like, look, it's no excuse. It's like time trouble. If you play stupid games, you're going to win stupid prizes. And it happens to everyone. It happens to me. It happens to the best of us. But you can see when you're in time trouble, your move quality goes down. And that's just a reality at every level of chess. All right, folks. Take care.